Okay, good morning, everyone. Let me start off by saying thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Jessica Lucas. I'm the Secretary Coordinator at the Ontario Association of Art Galleries, and I'm very happy to welcome everyone to our scenario planning webinar presented by the Ontario Association of Art Galleries and the Ontario Museum Association. Before we begin, I'd like to first acknowledge that Toronto, where the OMA and OEG offices are located, has been a site of human activity for over 15,000 years. This land is the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat. Today, Toronto is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community on this territory. So I hope everyone is doing well. I want to start by making sure that everyone knows how to participate during the webinar. So during the presentation, you'll be able to see the presenter and the slides simultaneously. If you'd like to ask a question or make a comment to the presenters, type any messages into the chat box. If you have questions, use the Q&A box specifically for your questions. During the webinar, there will be two opportunities to have your Q&As addressed by our facilitators, Judy and Karen, as well as Christopher Shackleton at the OMA is on hand to help moderate the chat and Q&A as well. The webinar is being recorded and we'll be able to have the recording available at a later date. And take it away to Chris.
Yeah, so today's webinar will be 90 minutes. We'll begin with an introduction and then we'll pass it over to our facilitators and panelists. And then we'll have time for questions and some announcements and wrapping up at around 11:30 this morning.
Perfect. So before we start, I just want to introduce our facilitators. Our facilitators are Consulting Matrix. Consulting Matrix provides advice and support to leaders in nonprofit organizations and governments across Canada. They specialize in governance, strategic planning, and relationship building. Judy, Wolfe, and Karen Wishart have been partners in Consulting Matrix since 2005 and are my 401 neighbors at OEG, so happy to see them. Judy has served many clients in the arts, from artist-run centers to public galleries, from art service organizations to provincial funders. Karen has served clients in the not-for-profit sector, particularly those involved in frontline service delivery, and leads the firm's Indigenous relations practice. We do have 4 panelists with us today. So our first panelist is Dimitra Christakos. Dimitra, the curator of the Art Gallery Sudbury, Gallery de Art de Sudbury. Prior, she served as the executive director of the Ontario Association of Art Galleries from 2001 to 2014. Dimitra Christakos produced the symposium Curating in the Haze of Empires and the Leadership of Cultural Pluralism Project, co-founded the PESO Coalition and the Bilingual Symposia website, Curators in Context, Commissaires en Context with Jules Godwin, and co-produced the symposium website Arts Institutions and the Feminist Dialectic with Carla Garnett. We have our second panelist, Alexander Gates from the Canadian Automotive Museum. Alexander Gates has served as the executive director and curator of the Canadian Auto Museum since 2014. Originally from the United States, he previously worked as the executive director and curator of the North Barron Historical Museum in Coloma, Michigan. Alex holds a BA in International Relations from Drake University, a Master's of Museum Studies degree from the University of Toronto, and studied French at the Sorbonne in Paris while working as a guide on the Eiffel Tower. As one of Canada's only automotive curators, Alex represents Canadian heritage around the world, working with international partners to tell Canada's unique car stories, while also serving as a local community partner in the redevelopment of downtown Oshawa. Our third panelist today is Brian Meehan from Museum London. Brian Meehan is the executive director and chief curator of Museum London in London, Ontario. Prior to this posting in 2000, he was director of the Tom Thompson Memorial Art Gallery in Owen Sound, Ontario. Raised in Calgary, Alberta, Brian attended the Alberta College of Art before receiving a Bachelor of Fine Arts degree from the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design. He also attended Concordia University of Montreal, where he did a postgraduate work in communication studies. Brian has been chair of the Canadian Art Museum Directors Organization, the Ontario Association of Art Galleries, and the Pillar Nonprofit Network. And our fourth panelist with us today is Janice Montour from Woodland Cultural Center. Janice Montour is from Six Nations of the Grand River Mohawk Nation Turtle Clan. Janice has recently returned as the Executive Director of Woodland Cultural Center. Previously, Janice was appointed the Director of Tourism and Cultural Initiatives for the Six Nations Development Corporation. Janice was the committee member of the Great Lakes Research Alliance for the Study of Aboriginal Arts and Cultures and for the Arts and Culture Advisory Council for the Toronto 2015 Pan Am Para-Pan American Games. So thank you, panelists, also for joining us today as well. It's greatly appreciated. And I'm going to now move this to Judy. Thanks, Judy.
Thank you, Jessica and Chris. Thank you very much for the invitation to do this and for sponsoring this whole thing. And I'm just trying to get my slides up there, share screen. There we go. And hello, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be working once again with the Ontario Association of Art Galleries and the Ontario Museums Association, and to have all of you joining us today. On the screen, you'll see the agenda we're proposing to go through today. What is scenario building? The steps in developing scenarios, how you use scenarios in planning, and then we've got some resources to share with you at the end. And as has been mentioned, we will pause for questions along the way, and we hope that your questions will be answered in terms of why you would use scenarios and how to do it. But of course, specific questions we'll probably have to get to later. And the panelists will also have some really good examples of how you use scenarios along the way. So I just wanted to tell you a bit, first of all, about the process we followed to get here. We met with the panelists, Karen and I, with the 4 panelists, your colleagues, on 4 successive Fridays for about an hour each time. We went through one of the steps each time. And you'll see the 4 steps shortly. We sent notes from each of the calls back to the participants and provided them with an agenda for the next call. This meant that everyone put some thought into what would be discussed and made the conversations interesting and productive. The participants then accepted the role of presenting the final matrices and spent some time discussing their task and preparing their notes. So we're immensely grateful to Janice, Demetra, Brian, and Alex for their contributions to this webinar. I have to remember which device I'm using now. Oops. Today's format, just wanted to reinforce, I'll be using PowerPoint. I'll try to remember to change the slides at the right time. And you'll be hearing my voice quite a lot, but we will invite remarks and comments from the panelists. And so you'll hear a few different voices, and Karen will moderate the questions and the answers. So what is scenario building? Planning always requires a bit of futurism. Those of you who remember the 70s will remember that predicting the future was quite an industry. Whether it was how technology was going to evolve, or what the price of oil was going to be, or what the role of women would be in the workforce, or what would happen if there was a nuclear meltdown, many people tried to predict what was going to happen. The job for everyone else was to think about how to respond to those changes, including whether to take them as serious possibilities or not. Clearly, hiding under a rock wouldn't work. So most of us, without putting a lot of effort into it, decided how to move forward, get an education, buy a smaller car. But at least one company, starting in the 60s actually, made a discipline of imagining what could happen if really major changes occurred and making contingency plans so they could be ready whatever happened. So indeed, when the oil crisis occurred in the mid-70s, one company was poised to take advantage and did so. After that, more people became very interested in thinking in a systematic way about the unknowable future. In 1989, another such cataclysm occurred when the Berlin Wall came down and the Soviet Union collapsed. While the Cold War had raged for decades, it had been the bedrock of America's idea of itself. Once it ended, both Russia, without an empire and with its economic system in disarray, and America, without a powerful enemy, and its sense of purpose in the world challenged, faced an uncertain future. America at least still seems to be trying to figure itself out. Anyway, if you cannot predict the long-term future accurately, and you certainly can't control it, if you spend the time to think about the kinds of things that might happen, you and your board of directors can be ready to face whatever comes. In this seminar, we'll show you the steps to building scenarios and talk about when you would use them for planning purposes. And this slide just gives you the background again. With scenarios, we can prepare for a range of risks and opportunities, so we're not surprised. And to reinforce, we're talking about the distant future, not today. So as we're talking about planning, I want to make it clear that scenarios are different from strategic planning. When you do your regular strategic planning, you're typically working with a 3 to 5 year horizon. There are still going to be surprises, but you can be reasonably confident about where you're going and how you'll get there and what the world will be like as you go along. Scenarios help you think differently about a longer time horizon. You and your organization will confront possibilities that may require a radical rethink of your mission, your audiences, your services. Risk management is at the root of why we look at scenarios. What is out there that we have never thought about? What would we do differently if we did know about it? And by the way, that can be a huge opportunity as well as a risk. Once you have the scenarios, you move towards strategic planning, of course. So let's look at the steps of how to build scenarios. The first thing you do is identify what drives your particular business operation. Then you describe the extreme possibilities, the worst and the best, for each of those factors. You choose 2 of them to consider together and describe the scenarios that could happen in each of those boxes. Once you've done that, you can choose the one you think is most likely and analyze how that would have an effect on what you do. But before you do that, you need to know where you are now. And I've just pulled together a bit of data for you. There's a lot more data that you could look at to consider where you are right now, but and you've been forced into thinking about this over the last 4 months as you shut your operations in the crisis and then thought carefully about how to shift online and reopen your facilities to the public. At a first meeting with the participants, Demetra suggested that we provide some basic data on the sector. And we also learned that we can't assume the galleries and museums are identical. In fact, all of you will be different, but you'll see between the unearned revenues on the left and the earned revenues on the right, the galleries on the top and the museums on the bottom, you have different proportions that come from different levels of government. Some have more earned revenue than unearned revenue, and so on. And each community will support its galleries and museums a little differently. So overall, according to this 2017 study, there was $1.1 billion of revenue coming into these 2 sectors in 2017. And there were 19.4 million visits in person and hundreds of million online, even in 2017. And then some other useful things here. Everybody was planning upgrades to their infrastructure already. I didn't even count how many holdings you have. There are so many. And only at that time, only about 16% of your artifacts were digitized in 2017.
Judy?
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. Before we carry on, your sound is a little bit crackly. I don't know if it's maybe the volume is too loud on your computer and there's feedback, or I don't know if you have headphones.
I do. I'll try that.
Okay. Thanks. Sorry. No, sorry about that.
You know, that's why we need our tech support. And as you're hearing me a lot, it's good to have decent sound. Is that better?
That's much better. Thank you so much.
No problem. Thank you for saying it. So looking quickly at the employment in heritage institutions, you're all well aware that the workforce is female, if we're speaking in binary terms, and very few visible minorities in either of your sectors. The age profile skews a little bit young, but you do have a number of people who are probably moving towards retirement age. And I was really interested in the job types, as you can see along the bottom. If you can't read that, we'll be sending these slides out to you. But a lot of people involved in education and programming and visitor engagement. The gift shop and catering and galleries I thought was very interesting. Administration, and then not so much in the archivist, librarian, conservation, preservation, curatorial and research, and then digital IT and so forth. The final data slide here, your tourism visitors. I don't have the total number for you here, but clearly at least half of your visitors were already coming from Ontario, some from the remainder of Canada, and obviously quite a few from the United States and overseas, which will be an issue now. And you've already been thinking a lot about the immediate effects of COVID-19, from the social isolation and distancing to unemployment, deaths, even the recession in the economy. But we're also learning about inequities that we had already forced to actually address, inequities that have always been there. And innovation, collaboration, mutual support are growing all the time, and people have time to pay attention in ways that they may have not before. So let's move to the first step in actually building your scenarios. The first thing you need to do is focus on the factors that contribute to or influence your business model the most. That is, why do you do what you do and how do you do it? I'll summarize discussions the panelists had as they identified the 4 driving factors based on these questions. We all agreed that there are more, but these are the ones that they settled on for this project, and they can provide additional comments in a few moments. So here are the factors that they agreed on: society, economy, proximity, and infrastructure. So for society, demographics, neighbors, how we treat each other. Obviously, we were holding these conversations in the context, on the one hand, of a pandemic, which encouraged people to look after another, and on the other hand, social upheaval over the way racism has been reinforced by policing. And you'll see this is all questions about what might happen. In terms of the economy, it's a strange but not entirely unique time to be discussing the economy. Governments in Canada seem to be prepared to spend unlimited amounts on some things, but not everything. Will it be enough to keep Canada from sliding into long-term recession, or will it spur more growth? What will happen to stock markets and the ability of private donors to support the arts? Will there be people with the training, the interest, the background available to work in our institutions? Will our budgets expand to pay the salaries that these people will expect and deserve? Where will our earned revenue come from? Proximity, something that we probably never had to think about before, but now it's driving so much of what you're thinking about. What will the impacts be on people's willingness to come back into closed spaces, and how will that affect what you decide to do, to offer and where? And finally, infrastructure. From repairing ancient HVAC systems and elevators to planning new facilities, climate change affects everything. The economy affects everything. The purpose that you're doing it for affects everything. So, and every community will be affected differently because of whether or not you have the bandwidth to deliver your programs online. Again, it's questions. Panelists, what have I missed here in the presentation of the factors that most affect your operation? Anything you'd like to add here? You're all on mute, so if you want to say something, you have to unmute yourself. All right then, Karen, I'll pass it to you for questions. And you have to unmute yourself.
So far, we don't have any questions.
Excellent, excellent. All right then, moving on. So the next step is to describe the extreme possibilities, and our little icon shows from the thunderstorm to the sunshine, which in Ontario seems to happen on a daily basis, but we're talking about much longer term here. So things can change a little, or they can change dramatically. They can change so slowly that you don't notice until it's too late. Below climate change. We don't even remember what the world was like before, or they can change suddenly, as happening right now. And some of these factors matter to our organization, or they're so far beyond our control, we can't do anything about that. But others are so profound that our very purpose is called into question. And I think the one that really struck the two that struck, well, we'll get into this, but social justice and proximity certainly were things that we talked a lot about. But let's just look at the factors and the polls that the panelists came up with. I'm supposed to talk about them now. So for society, your colleagues described the ends as a fractured society in which there's a breakdown of social relationships, there's a lack of trust, there's systemic racism, there's inequality. On the other side, a healthy society is one in which people like each other, they're well educated, they support and enjoy the arts, people help each other out when needed. When there's civil unrest or worse, the implications for a collection could be severe, as was discovered during World War II, and some of you may already have a plan for that. For our economy, we can imagine that a prolonged downturn could lead to a long recession with unemployment, increased poverty, lower government revenues. At the other end, sustained growth could bring increasing budgets, investments in people and infrastructure, rising incomes, and broad support for arts and culture. Proximity led to discussions of whether people would ever feel comfortable returning to closed spaces. Galleries and museums have found ways to open safely already, but not everyone is rushing to return. If a vaccine is found, people may once again want to gather in community and will want to have more meaningful experiences when they do. Some people may never go back. And I don't know if you saw the very interesting results of a survey that was done by the Confederation Center for the Arts in Charlottetown, where they found that at least some people will never travel again and may never go back to the theater. These have real consequences. Finally, infrastructure, which refers to both physical and digital infrastructure, is closely connected to another major trend in our time, climate change. Will our infrastructure collapse from poor maintenance, or will governments and private companies continue to build new and better? Once you've figured out those polarities, you can start to think about the implications of those possible changes on your activities. So let's look, for example, at whether or not, what would happen if there was an economic recession. And part of this is political. We don't know what the political ideology of any particular government is going to be. So we have to ask, will governments continue to pour money into creating employment? Or will people continue to buy memberships and pay to visit galleries? Will they buy jewelry? Will they buy art at museums? Will tourism and related hospitality businesses survive? And will philanthropists continue to be generous? We already hear some stories in the short term, but we're thinking now longer term. So we ask questions to which we don't have immediate answers. And you may have information sources or experts who can reduce the uncertainty of those questions. But for the most part, we ask questions that have no answers right now. So the third step is to choose two factors and describe the scenarios. One of the reasons that we can't answer our questions is that the world is more complicated than that. To every action, there's an equal and an opposite reaction. And a change in one factor can have a significant impact on the direction of change of another factor. So now we choose two of the factors and start to see how they interact. The panelists proposed two different sets of factors to work with. Remember, we started with 4, and so that gives you 6 possibilities. They chose 2. So this that we're describing to you now is by necessity a simplified approach. If you had time and the brain space and the computing power, you might consider how all of these interact and how things might evolve over time. I'm going to ask Janice Montour and Alex Gates to present the first matrix. Janice, would you like to start by telling us why you chose to put these two factors together?
Yes, absolutely. Sego, everyone. So the reason we chose the proximity and infrastructure continuum was the issue regarding physical infrastructure, as well as how and relevant if people can gather physically, as these are two major concerns impacting a lot of museums and galleries. We asked the question, will we be able to bring in our community over and over again into our spaces if we don't have infrastructure dollars to enhance our gallery and exhibition spaces to bring those same people in? Without the larger visitorship from beyond the region to draw on, are we going to be able to get repeat visitors? Do we have to start looking at our presence in the digital sector? What does that mean from an infrastructure perspective? For example, I live in a community that doesn't have good bandwidth and the lack of internet, which is very common for First Nations communities. So looking at connecting with them, it would be very difficult without having the bricks and mortars and people gathering physically. So I'm going to speak to our continuum that we took two opposite poles examples. So I will speak to the engagement and prosperity. So this enjoyable experience scenario is looking at everything is going great. We have, great support from the government who are going to increase infrastructure dollars to enhance both physical structures and digital platforms, which would provide us with sustainable long-term physical plant. Investment in physical and digital infrastructure dollars positively impacts the local economy. New spaces with up-to-date and environmentally friendly design leaves less of a carbon footprint. It also will help us improve infrastructure such as new HVAC systems to provide a safe space for collections. Physical infrastructure improvements allows for less energy, a cost savings to institutions' operating expenditures. New physical infrastructure also enables sites to be fully accessible. Enhancing our digital platforms, such as e-commerce websites, virtual exhibitions, video guides, museum apps that integrate with local community, artists, and museum/art gallery. Online learning platforms could greatly expand audience development through digital workshops and audience engagement. Additions to existing infrastructure could enhance building capacities to allow for enhanced programming. For example, additional seating in the galleries, more diversified exhibitions, more spaces to program, and increased revenue generation through sales. People gathering creates a community within the cultural institution that will all come together for shared experiences. However, an online community is just as important as a physical gathering. For the next sort of the opposite end of our continuum, I'm going to have Alex explain his continuum.
Thank you, Janice. So I got the lovely task of thinking about the chaos that would occur. I think Judy assigned us that title for our bottom quadrant, and this is something we don't like to think about very often. But it's this idea of, we're not going to be able to have people gathering in mass anymore. So we're going to have limited capacity in our facilities. And on top of that, our facilities are not going to be as high quality as we want them to be. And so this is both going to have a budget concern moving forward, but also going to have an impact in terms of our programming. So in terms of the budget, many of us have older facilities that need to have repairs done. And so we're looking at those capital grants. Are those going to be available next year, 5 years down the road? What's going to happen to our facilities in terms of deferred maintenance, in terms of using our facilities when those crowds can come back. It's also going to lead to a very high operating cost per person. So we're expecting to have less people coming through our galleries. What does that mean? What does that mean if you're an organization that offers free admission to your visitors and to your community. You're not going to have revenue coming in. The facility is going to have issues bringing those crowds into free events. How many people can we possibly have at one time? We're going to have to spread these events out over longer periods of time. Are we going to be able to have special events? Also, are we going to be able to move to more outdoor spaces? So this can be a benefit for larger sites. So I often think about historic heritage villages, those types of sites that have a lot of space compared to, say, art galleries that have very confined indoor spaces for the most part. And what does this mean for the wealthy versus the less wealthy communities? Are we going to have a difference here between what people can pay to go through in terms of what people can pay for membership? Wealthier arts organizations with those donors, they can afford higher ticket prices, smaller groups coming through compared to organizations that really look for the large crowds coming through throughout the year. So these are just a number of the things. We can go on for hours about this, but sort of high level points, just thinking about space, social distance, and our capacity and taking care of our audiences. I'll turn it back over to, I believe, Judy now, and we'll move on to the next set of scenarios.
Thank you. I'm just going to take us back up here for a second to the slide with the two arrows here, just to be clear that what you guys did was when you cross these over and you've got your positive up here and your negative down here, positive over here, negative over here, then you can really think about what does that mean if the community can gather and infrastructure. And what we're developing the matrix is to find a name that's memorable for each of those quadrants. So we had engagement and prosperity, living with class, when you can still see everybody, but your experience isn't so great when you go out. Or you still don't have money for anything. Chaos, as Alice described, and tech world, where keep your distance, but you have additional infrastructure to keep everybody engaged that way. So I just wanted to go through the four quadrants. So I'll do that again when we get down to
Judy?
Society versus economy. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt again. It's Jessica. We're having some sound issues with you, and I think it might be an internet capacity with you sharing your screen.
Oh.
Karen can share her screen and slides, and we'll see if that helps, because you're breaking up a little bit. Sorry to.
Oh, that's okay. Thank you.
So I don't know.
Karen, can you do it?
I can. So give me a minute to get it going here.
Okay, well, I'll turn mine off for a minute and stop share. There we go. My speaker is not working. Please check your connection or use a different speaker. I don't understand. Can you hear me better now, Jessica?
Yeah, I can hear you better now. And then Karen, if you can turn into there we go. You're already there.
Reading view.
Yes.
All right. And then what slide were we on?
We were on second matrix.
There we go. Is that it?
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
that's it.
So Judy, you may need to say next slide if I lose track, but I'll give
Okay. All right.
And we'll see if that helps. Sorry about that.
Well, no, thank you. I mean, this is the fun of webinars, and thank you for participants for your patience. So here we are, matrix number 2, and Brian, you were going to begin by telling us why you chose these two factors, and maybe describe the 4 quadrants as well. Thank you.
Sure. So we wanted to look both at the economic situation, because we're in a situation right now where we really don't know, coming out of COVID, what the future holds in store for both the general economy, but the economies of galleries and museums. So that was the one. The other is, we do find, as you mentioned earlier, this time has given us the time to, or has sort of reinforced inequities in our society. And so we wanted to consider what the future will look like if we move towards a more healthy society, or if we kind of remain or even go farther into kind of a fractured or unequal society. So best case scenario, the upper right is the equality and prosperity. So, you know, there is abundance, the economy is good, and it's the wealth is spread around, and the wealth is also coming from a lot of different places and a lot of different people rather than just a few sources of income. Moving to the left, you know, the economic situation isn't as good as we'd like it to be, but you know, society is moving in the right direction and is healthier. So we've got less money, we've got less abundance, but people are sharing more and working together. The bottom left is sort of like the chaos situation in the last one. Worst case scenario, everybody for themselves. There's real competition for scarce resources, and so people are, if not fighting, they're certainly trying to get everything for themselves and not being as cooperative. And then the one that I'll talk a little bit more about is the winners and losers. You know, the economy is recovered, but we still haven't moved from an unequal society. So if you want to go to the next slide. You know, we sort of identified this as probably the most likely scenario for 5 to 10 years out. The likelihood is the economy recovers and is reasonably strong, and the likelihood is we remain a somewhat fractured or unequal society. So given this situation, you know, we're thinking what can we do given the arts is positioned to be in a position to affect positive change, and that's a role that we potentially can play. Museums' response to social justice and reconciliation will be tied to their relevance. The thought was that, like most institutions and organizations today, there's a real need to respond both quickly but also long-term to Black and Indigenous issues. To remain relevant and maintain the support of our communities. And you know, the feeling is if we don't, we run the risk of being seen as irrelevant and potentially suffering the implications of that, particularly the possibility of decreased funding. Funding, we see potentially as being tied to these issues. The reality is funding bodies, whether they're the councils or foundations, as well as individual donors, are directing their support more and more to organizations that are taking these issues serious. And so we need to think about long-term, how do we address these issues, both in our programming, but also how we conduct business on a daily basis. I think the reality is government funders are beginning to become more active in tying their political and social agendas to their funding decisions. So reconciliation and social justice are high on their list of actions that need to be taken to gain support from them. Policies, if not in place now, need to be developed to facilitate this work. We need to start planning now, especially given that the things that'll happen 5 to 10 years out do need to have policies put in place now so that we can be positioned to take advantage of those situations when they come related to changing the makeup of our staff or our boards. We also need to be looking at how we recruit and not only how we recruit, but where we recruit from. There are things that can happen sooner than that. Things like collecting and acquisition policies can change almost immediately. The situation creates an opportunity to provide a space to discuss, argue, and broker these issues. Museums have historically been seen as safe and trusted places for the exchange of ideas, and a museum like ours, which has a broad educational mandate, will still need to take a firm position on the issues, but we can do this and create dialogue.
Thanks, Brian. Did you want to pass it on to Dimitra?
Sorry about that. Yes, Dimitra is going to take the upper left quadrant to talk about.
Thank you very much, Brian. So I'm going to try to share my screen. Oh, okay, it says it's going to stop the, you know what, never mind.
That's okay. No, go ahead. I think it's okay. I can restart after you're done.
Sorry about this, guys. Okay, so I really appreciated the thinking to this point. I have a very hard time just looking at scenarios without trying to see how they impact on our organization. And I just wanted to look at this document quickly and show you what my thinking was. One was that my quadrant, were trending towards a healthy society on the left, but long-term recession along the top. That's the horizontal axis. The title is "We're All in This Together." I do find that this is very similar to my day-to-day circumstance. So I did want to challenge my thinking. Judy also provided a number of modes of consideration, and they run down this light blue column. In thinking about 5 to 20 years down the road, what could we do with community access, mission, factors impacting leadership, need for volunteers, partnerships, what will our relationships with artists be like, looking at collections and intellectual property, our resource base, which Brian did a good job of addressing, and capital facilities and equipment needs. So in the consideration 5 to 20 years down the road, which is kind of what we're doing right now, I was also trying to figure out what are the things that we can do. And, you know, the first consideration is, as Brian was saying, what is the viability of our charitable objects, which in our case is part of our, you know, charitable registration, going back also to our letters patent. They're basically our constating documents. How can we test that viability? We need to reach out, communicate, invite the community back in and test the basics. In terms of leadership, if we have declining cash resources, it seemed to me that, you know, adding resilience into our business planning would force us to rely more on our boards, and a strong focus on board leadership skills and training, and the ability to assess and reassess the vulnerabilities of our core revenues was pretty, it's pretty eye-opening, and it's challenging to look at what happens when, as we've seen in the last 3 months, there's a very strong challenge to your normal asset base and revenue streams. And in my case, I found that I was very much reliant on my board, and luckily they're very newly renewed, and they've just been like a shook up bottle of pop in the last 3 months. And I think that we haven't really looked at that in a long time. We certainly did in the 90s when we were in somewhat similar circumstances, but focusing on board leadership skills and training was something that we could do. And the volunteer base is very important. How can we create new partnerships and open up and strengthen our networks, which is something we had to do in the early 2000s for sure. I remember this at OAG. All projects must be collaborative, and that's somewhat different, I think, from the winners and losers kind of prospectus that Brian was describing. Artists are key to our work. How can our relationships with artists deepen and broaden if there is a protracted recession? You know, we again need to match our words with deeds and be good actors and help monetize artist transactions, as we have been doing. Public art galleries have been doing this for the last 30 years. We're not really getting a lot of credit for that, but we need to continue to value and monetize our artist transactions in the same way we would do with every other element of, you know, our communities. And, you know, just looking down, training board volunteers in their roles as museum fiduciary trustees, to me, that's really, really important. And it's something that can go absent during the good times. because we have enough money for a more fully described professional team, and boards are able to sort of step up into this higher role of providing advice and not necessarily engaged in the working of the organization in a way that much smaller organizations, and I found when I got back to Sudbury, our board volunteers are active contributors to our base. And then, you know, we looked to business continuity planning, which was new to me, to help us get through COVID. And the process of business continuity planning and the process of planning in general was very, very useful. In our case, this is at the very end. Our key question is, how are we going to take care of our collections going forward? Because as museums, the collections are that 90% that float below really the level of public visibility. And there's always been a strategy of making do and innovating with what we have. But we want to be prepared for strategic investment from government. And in our case at the Art Gallery of Sudbury, the need to get more digital is extremely important to us, as is getting ready for our new gallery project.
Thank you very much, all of our participants. That was really helpful. Karen, can you go to the step 4 slide? And moving on here. So as I mentioned, when you have 4 factors, you could have 6 possible matrices, but the group chose those 2 because they made the most sense to them. It's a good exercise to go through all of the possibilities and see what you might be missing if you took 2 others. You know, what happens when fractured society meets social isolation? What happens when economy meets infrastructure? Some of these could happen, but the impact on your institutions or sector may or may not be significant. So when you're doing this, choose the matrix and the quadrant that are A, most relevant, and B, most likely to occur. And that will help you to think about the implications. Could you go now to slide 30?
Sorry, can you say that again? You're still breaking up a little bit.
Slide 42, please. There you go. So here's the, you know, Dimitri mentioned that we had provided a list of things to think about. So this is what we think your sector may need to think about. We could be right, we could be wrong. You may have other things you want to look at. And so what is that? Posted up my video. I hope that. You may have seen that we have many challenges when we start. We can be optimistic, or we can be nervous about what we observe going on. So however you imagine the future, you can prepare to meet it. And as you have been hearing, once you have this scenario, you actually start immediately to think of implications and start thinking about making plans. So when would you use scenarios? When you need to have a deep conversation with your board and your professional team. You use them when you're facing a completely unpredictable world like right now. You use them when you need to think far into the future, when you're planning needs to be reasonable or starting a new institution. Use them to think of thinking when people listen to everything as it always has. Next. But you do want to start the planning conversation. do this, they will evolve. You'll start with those factors, you'll put them together, you'll think about what's going on in that scenario, and you'll share ideas. So what if this happens? What if this happens? And then you can start getting to, well, okay, we think that this is the most likely case, and it's going to probably happen over the next 10 years. Now you can start to think, well, what does that mean? How will we change? When will we have to change? You'll still get to a single goal or vision. The scenarios just help you to meet whatever else might come along and how to make whatever decision you have to make. Next. So panelists, coming back on again, how do you think you and your organizations might use scenario planning based on what you've done so far? Demetra, you were first up.
Oh, that's a problem. No. I would have to say I would use scenario planning honestly for myself as director curator, for my own deep thinking. And you, in the middle of the kind of circumstances we've had in the last 3 or 4 months, you know, I in a very small organization, but nonetheless, you know, there's 32 people that look to me for support and confirmation, or even, you know, to be inspired and to move forward. And I think this idea of scenario planning really struck a chord with me as to how I could look at the intersection of a couple of key pressures and, you know, find a path for myself as to move forward. So I would probably pause and do that first, use it for myself as a planning tool. And then when I had, you know, more clarified thought, I might bring it, just as we've done here, a couple of visualizations into communication with my staff and my team, because I think it does help people get the, you know, organize their thoughts. Everybody organizes their thoughts and expresses themselves very differently. I happen to be language-based, but also highly visual, and every member of my team receives information and processes information entirely differently. We have a very small team, and then the same is true for my board. So I would probably go through that kind of stepped process and be very selective and careful about how I introduced it to at the board level, only because when we're in the middle of a crisis, we do go to those extremes in our thinking as an anxiety response. And my job as director curator is often to, yeah, allow people to express that anxiety, but to somehow bring them back to more of a centered core, not to exclude possibilities, but to, you know, reassure the board that, you know, we found this with business continuity planning. Yes, you may not realize this. We have 4 kinds of insurance. We've got, you know, a board planning document. We have emergency plans. You know, I remember at OAG, between OAG and OMA, Marie Lalonde can remember this. We're presenting the CCI workshop on emergency planning every year, if not every second year. Some of those core basics, many of those things museums already have in place.
Thank you. That's terrific. I appreciate that. Brian.
Well, I think what actually going through this exercise has brought me to realize is that, you know, so much of the planning that we do is strategic planning. We don't often think of scenario planning. We don't often think of very long-term planning, but just the example that we came up with is actually something that I'll be proposing to our board. It's interesting with scenario planning because it's not looking at just the immediate, but it's looking much longer term. I think the board will have a different approach to it and a different investment in that. I think for the most part, they can approach it a little more conceptually rather than practically, because the results of what they come up with, or we come up with in the scenario planning, will actually be implemented in a sense after they're gone and after I'm gone. You know, boards are, you know, most people are on boards for, you know, 3 to 6 years. If we're looking at the scenario planning 5 to 20 years out, they're basically, or we'd be basically setting the foundation for actions of the organization. And so it'll be interesting. I think the inequality issue is one that, you know, is a reality for our organization. We've talked about diversity, you know, on a board, on staff, but there hasn't been a great deal of action. So taking this approach with the board, I think will be, I think it'll work out quite well.
Thank you. Janice.
Yeah, so this process definitely came at a very interesting time for me. I just returned back to the organization, so right in the middle of COVID. And so this gave me an opportunity to sort of really look at not necessarily the immediate, but also the 5 to 20 year plan out. The scenario planning, what I feel would be most beneficial at sort of the work plan and board planning sessions that I would have annually, so that the board themselves can think of sort of the much bigger vision and future, and also how they would impact and how it would go down into the organization itself. So I think a lot of times I'm in the middle of actually just redoing a strategic plan for the next 5 years. So this really makes, I think, will assist our strategic plan once it's completed for the board to really look at that sort of longer term vision of 10 and 15 and 20 years out. I see it more as an annual thing for the board, but also my senior management team to really look at what our priorities are. I think we get very caught up in the whirlwind of our day-to-day and even what sort of gets thrown on us on a sort of more regular basis. And we sort of sometimes lose sight of how our organization will impact the future.
Thank you. And Alex.
Just following up on what's already been said. Yeah, I think the difference between scenario planning and strategic planning is none of us ever really have a strategic plan for things getting worse over the next 3 to 5 years, right? I think generally when we sit down with our board and we have a consultant come in, you know, we talk about, okay, we're gonna, you know, do more fundraising, we're gonna increase our numbers, we're going to, you know, do all these great things, and then we go to our municipalities and our levels of government and say, of course, they need to fund us. Great things are going to happen. And we're not going to say, well, actually, we're planning on 50% staff reductions. We're planning on shorter hours. But I think with scenario planning, it allows us to do that. We're obviously not going to share it with our, you know, at the wrong time with our membership. But it's good to have in the back of your mind, you know, what if, you know, there are drastic cuts to municipal funding or earned income streams that you might not think about. You know, what's that going to do to your organization? You know, how long can you continue on with that? You know, for 3 years, for 20 years, what's that going to look like in terms of your structure of your organization? And I think these are, you know, not just thought experiments to have, but really things to just sort of work through with your board in terms of, you know, what could happen in the future and, you know, how that would affect your operations and your own job. So. Very important to think about and very different, I think, from strategic planning, which tends to be a very positive, you know, upbeat discussion that we all want to dig into. And, you know, you have to do them both at the same time. And I think we're all going to consider that differently moving forward.
Great. Thank you very much. Karen, I think we're over to you again.
Hi there, sorry about that. We have only a couple of questions so far, but I thought we could take a little, and I'll moderate those. But in the meantime, because there were a couple of points in which the sound was sadly a little bit bad, Judy, so people may have missed some things you said. If there are some points in the presentation that people wouldn't mind revisiting, I think this would, just let me know in the Q&A section and we'll do that. But the questions we have so far are pretty straightforward. One, Demetra, will you share the chart with people if they would like it?
Of course.
Okay, great. There was also a question about whether the PowerPoint slides would be shared, and absolutely. First of all, this will be available on YouTube, but I put in the answer section if you will contact us, Karen or Judy at consultingmatrix.com. We'd be happy to share the slides with you. And then let me find the other ones here. There was also ahead of time, there were a couple of questions. Some of them were very solution-based, which we're not really set up to address. But a couple of people identified the fact that they were really interested in or struggling with thinking about their educational programming. So I wondered if any of the panelists would like to share their thoughts about, how they, whether there were things that popped up during the scenario building process that directly related to educational programming, or whether they could see how that could be used. I was thinking, Brian, you mentioned specifically that, your organization is an educational institution. Maybe you'd like to start?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think what came out during this process was, the scenario planning is pretty high level, but what we are moving towards, or what we think we're moving towards, has to kind of be manifest in all aspects of the organization. So it's not just, if we're looking at a more equal society, it's not just making sure that there's greater representation on our boards and greater representation on staff, but that it has to kind of be expressed in everything that we do. So, our education programs, our exhibitions, basically every aspect of the organization has to sort of manifest that that reality that we're planning for.
Cool. I want Demetra.
So in terms of education at the Art Gallery of Sudbury, the impact of COVID, just because of the work that my colleague Nancy Guerra has done in terms of building up our education profile and our programs over 17 years, art education was the earned revenue and activity component in our gallery that was most hard hit financially, and also in terms of process. We're very much about the bespoke person-to-person art making experience, and we deliver about 7,000 of these exchanges that are very well received, very meaningful, and very persuasive to government when they see our statistics. All of that was taken away with COVID. So this idea of scenario planning, in fact, is, I think, useful even on the micro level of working with a team that's had all of its tools taken away and isn't able to come together, but has to find a way to work digitally. And they've pivoted in a way that's terrific. We have very modest resources in comparison to larger organizations. And this idea of, okay, what happens in September when, if schools are back, if schools aren't back, if there's a mix between what kind of in-person activities can we have? What kind of activities are we going to have to figure out how to deliver digitally? And then all the monetization of that, which in our case is about $90,000 a year, disappeared. So figuring out, will people, when we get to that stage and we've rehearsed it, what can we monetize in this new kind of delivery? And, and then on the larger side, organizationally, how are we going to prepare the organization to have basically 15% of our core earned revenues just disappear, and then see how they can be built back up. So I could see it definitely working, not on that high, not just on the high level, but in the micro level as well.
Great, thank you. Janice, do you have thoughts you'd like to share about this?
Sure. So I think for when you were asking the question about education and coming same words to Dimitra, so what we were sort of already looking at was we were over capacity in regards to our education program. So we had long wait lists to get in. Obviously, you can see behind me in the residential school. So the residential school tour was already overextended. So the organization had 3 years ago already had the insight to start doing video presentations and actually doing a film of the residential school tour as a virtual tour. And thankfully we did that, because when COVID hit, all of our, and even during the school strike, a lot of our tour requests had dropped, and now, we're to a zero income. So the scenario plan really helped us sort of identify. We went from, overextended in the education program to none. Thankfully, the virtual tour of the school was available for us. And so we've now uploaded that, and we're getting subscriptions now for virtual groups, virtual group tours. So I think just really looking at what your capacity is in your organization, and doing what you can. I mean, my education team was definitely limited, and my marketing coordinator came to me and just said, listen, we have some of these resources. I know it's really short notice, but I can get these up on the website like tomorrow if everything's approved. And so having your team really think outside the box is key, because it wasn't even me going to them being like, okay, what are we doing now for plan B? And they came to me and said, listen, like, this is ready, let's just go with it.
Awesome, that's great, thank you. Alex, thoughts?
Well, if you remember back to January, I know it's a long time ago, back before COVID, we actually had a teacher's strike going on here in Ontario. And it's interesting, the conversations we were having at that point also related to earned income from field trips and sort of the future of that, with field trips being canceled throughout, already being canceled throughout this spring, but even before COVID hit. And so this is something, I guess, those of us who love museums, we sort of have fond memories of our museum field trips when we were children, back in the last century. But it's something that we've seen here at the automotive museum, slowly the lack of tours being booked, or only having, say, high school automotive classes coming anymore, as we fall outside of the kind of the mainstream curriculum in terms of what our subject matter is. So it's something that we've already been looking at. I think might have already been a trend towards, not having in-person visitors from schools, which has definitely affected earned income, but also our impact and reaching school children. There's a lot of data on visiting museums and art galleries as children, and that leading to lifelong habits of visiting cultural institutions later on through that early exposure. So it's a huge issue for our field. And I think something that collectively we're all in this together in terms of that reach, but also monetizing programs, so we can have some income from doing these programs as well. And I think we're in this, and the schools as well. I think everyone's really thinking hard about this. And I think we're going to see a fairly major shift here in the next few years.
That's great. Oh, thank you all very much. Dimitra, did you want to say? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, just in terms of from where we were in March when we closed to today, which is July the 14th, on a more positive note, my education team has been receiving requests from teachers to deliver some of these virtual experiences we've been developing over the past 3 months already. So I thought that was very heartening. My team is going to be working in the same way that they would normally do, except trying to figure out a virtual delivery, for example, in working with a teacher who has a classroom of children or a group of children that are autistic. And that is going, that's the kind of stuff that gets the juices going for the team. So it was a nice burst of energy to get that back from the team, because they've been doing a great job, but kind of wondering what's going to happen in the fall. So some of that learning that they've done and we've all done may bear positive fruit in the fall.
Great, thank you very much. I will share the slides again.
Thank you.
There we go.
So,
Over to you, Judy.
all right. Well, I hope that my sound is working again. Just wanted to wrap up by saying there are the 4 steps to building the scenarios. After you've looked at where you are now, you identify what drives your business, describe the extreme possibilities, the worst and the best for each of those drivers. Choose 2 to consider together and describe the scenarios that could happen. Label the quadrants so that you have an easy reminder of what you're talking about. Choose your base case, meaning the most relevant and the most likely to occur, and analyze how that's going to impact your organization. Always ask, what if? What if there is nobody coming back into our gallery? What if there are no digital opportunities? What if we have all the money in the world? Take time when there's a lot at stake. Really spend some time with this. Have the conversations that you need to have. The process can be time consuming, but we hope you also find that it inspires creativity and helps you to have great discussions about how to lead your organization into the future. Next slide. So you'll see that there are actually lots of YouTube videos about building scenarios and how to use them. And then there are 2 articles that I recommend to you, both quite old, but that really give the basic foundation for how to do scenario planning. The data that we provided came from 2 sources, the 2017 report on the Survey of Heritage Institutions and the Ministry of Tourism and Culture's research site on travel activities. So in conclusion, thank you so much. Thank you again to our 4 fabulous panelists, Dimitra Christakos, Alexander Gates, Janice Montour, and Brian Meehan, and to the Ontario Museums Association and the Ontario Association of Art Galleries for hosting today's webinar. And thank you all for participating. Back to you, Jessica and Chris.
Thank you. Thank you, Judy and Karen. Really appreciate that. And thank you, Dimitra, Brian, Janice, and Alex. Chris has a few outro remarks.
So yes, so thank you to all of our panelists for sharing today. I know I learned a lot about scenario planning and scenario building. And thank you to all of you who signed in today. The recording will be available as soon as we can get it edited and up back on YouTube. So the OMA will be taking a break for the next several weeks as the province moves to stage 3 of reopening across many different jurisdictions. But we have some exciting things in the planning stages, so please stay tuned to our social media and your weekly On Museums newsletters to stay informed about upcoming events and professional development opportunities. So you can consult our document known as Guidance for Museums Reopening After Closure Due to COVID-19 if your museum is in the process or considering reopening to the public. And from OAG, they have a Member Monday meetup.
So OAG has been holding our bi-weekly Member Monday virtual meetups. Our next one is on July 20th at 2 p.m. These Member Monday meetups are an opportunity for our members to check in with one another and discuss the challenges they're currently facing during the COVID crisis. They're peer discuss solutions, but they're also a safe space for information sharing, support, and strengthen our public art gallery network. You can register and find more information about it at our response platform, our response.oag.org. And another thing to look forward for is we aim to propel and support art galleries to work with data, and we'll be commencing a 3-year program that will take 3 cohorts of art galleries through a mentor process to develop their practice in data-driven decision-making. We'll have more information about this program and registration for the first cohort shortly, so please look out for our mailing list, and also do keep in touch with us as soon as possible if you're interested in participating.
And further to these conversations about data and planning, you'll be directed to a survey upon leaving our webinar today, so please answer those questions. Those responses really do help both the OMA and OAG learn more about what people are looking for in webinars and webinar content. So as you know, this webinar was offered free of charge as a service to the community during what are very challenging times for everyone as organizations and individuals. If you are able, there are some things you can do to help support OAG and the OMA to continue to provide these timely and accessible resources. If you are a member, please renew your membership when you receive an email reminder. And if you're not a member, please consider becoming one, either as an institution or as an individual. You can find information about member categories and benefits on our websites. Or consider making a donation to either the OMA or OAG, and you can do so on our websites. Your support of our associations and your participation in events like this webinar make us stronger as a sector, and we appreciate each and every one of you. So this slide shows the OAG COVID-19 response website at response.oag.org, where you can find the most up-to-date relevant news and resources to help the public art sector through the COVID crisis. This slide is the OMA's homepage, and you can click to access COVID-19 resources, which is updated regularly for museums as resources become available. So you can click through there and see all those COVID-19 resources from the OMA. Yeah, so please do stay in touch. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you everyone for joining. Really appreciate it. Have a great day.